Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back for more conversations. Our show today is about tariffs and trade. Michael Froman is with us. He comes with a daunting and enviable resume. He graduated from my favorite college, Princeton, with a major in international affairs. He earned a PhD at Oxford, focusing on détente and American political discourse. He has a law degree, which he obtained in 1991 from Harvard, and served on the iconic Harvard Law Review with Barack Obama. Mike was a White House fellow, where he worked on economic and domestic policy. In the Clinton years, he held several important positions in government. In 2013, President Obama appointed him to his cabinet as United States Trade Representative. Fortune called him one of the world's 50 greatest leaders, and Politico, one of the 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries shaping American politics. In July 2023, Michael Froman became the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, where he has, among other things, focused on trade and tariff issues. We're pleased to welcome Michael Froman to the program.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
So, Michael, you were educated as kind of a Soviet expert. How'd you get interested in trade?
Well, that's right. I always had a strong interest in negotiations, and you're right, both as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, focused on U.S.-Soviet relations, arms control negotiations, and then the Cold War came to an end, and economics became more and more important, and I repurposed myself, I suppose, from using my interest in negotiations, from being an arms control negotiator to being a trade negotiator.
A rebirth.
Absolutely.
Now, you wrote an article recently where you said in your family, it all comes down to trade. Now, what do you mean by that? I mean, in your family, it doesn't come down to Iran or Russia or China?
No.
It all comes down to trade.
It all comes down to trade. Whatever we're studying or whatever my children are studying or wherever we're traveling, somehow we manage to make it all about trade. And my favorite instance was my son and I were in Istanbul once. We went on a boat ride around the Bosphorus, and there you could see the shipping containers going back and forth, these amazing cargo ships up and down the Bosphorus, and nowhere more than in that place you get a feel of just how central trade is, and those major trading routes and how significant they are to geopolitics, to international relations, to foreign policy.
But for many years, trade was kind of off the radar screen. People were interested in war and war's alarms, and Terrorism, certainly very high on the list. And now trade seems to be everyone's focus. How does that happen?
I am very grateful to President Trump for making trade great again. He has certainly brought it back to the front burner of issues. And look, I think part of it is over the last several decades, there's been increasing focus on it as people have seen the impact of technology, of trade, of globalization on the U.S. economy. And some of that has been used to generate some politics around populism and protectionism. And certainly the president, who's had a long-standing view on trade, goes back decades. I think there's an interview he did with Larry King in 1987 where he talked about tariffs and trade. He has made this a major part of his effort to raise questions about the international system that we've lived under for the last 80 years.
So in that respect, he's been consistent.
He has been consistent.
Now, how is it that we evolved from globalization, which certainly was your focus under Obama when you were U.S. Trade Representative, to tariffs, which seem to be top of everybody's list as something of importance?
Well, tariffs have always played a role in trade policy, usually when you're dealing with a country that's engaged in unfair trade practices. If you can't convince them to change their practices otherwise, you have the ability to put tariffs on them. I think what President Trump has done is taken it obviously much further and said that whatever we agreed to, whatever international obligations or commitments we have, we are going to use tariffs as a source of leverage over other countries to get them to come to the table on any number of issues, some related to trade and economics, but it could be around migration or around fentanyl or other issues as a source of revenue, and he's wanted to raise revenue from tariffs in part to pay for his tax cuts or to substitute for income taxes, but also as a way of driving the reindustrialization of the United States. And he has laid out a vision for the United States where we would be manufacturing a lot more than we currently do. And he believes by putting up a wall of tariffs, it will force companies to move their production and move their supply chains to the United States if they want to serve the U.S. market.
Well, is there a flaw in that reasoning? I mean, certainly they're not going to move their factories to the United States overnight, point one. It's going to take a long time for that to play out. Secondly, you have the factor of automation. It's not necessarily going to produce jobs for Americans. Third, you have the factor of inflation. High tariffs are inflationary, everyone seems to think. We haven't felt the impact of it yet, but it's certainly on the horizon. So, I mean, is the game worth the candle here?
Well, look, we're involved in a grand experiment, and we will see how it plays out over time. Certainly other countries have tried to use tariffs as a way of driving domestic production. We used to call it import substitution, and places like Argentina used it for years, and of course did not succeed in driving it. So one question is, will tariffs alone be enough to move production, or do you also need broader industrial policy on key sectors where you're actually subsidizing or incentivizing companies to move their production here as well? Is a carrot enough, or do you, is a stick enough, or do you also need some carrots as well? To your second point, it is unclear whether we can or should move production of every product back to the United States. It would be inherently much more expensive to do so, and that raises the costs of inflation, not just for consumers, but also for other manufacturers who rely on imported inputs right now, whether it's steel or aluminum or parts, to make their products cost competitive. And if they have to build all of their parts and get all of their inputs in the United States, to the degree that that's even possible, it will make them more expensive and therefore less competitive. And then finally, to your point, manufacturing now is much different than manufacturing in the 1950s or 60s. And if we are going to have many more factories here, they're likely to be much more automated. And so we have to distinguish between whether the goal is to have a larger percentage of our GDP be made out of manufacturing, or a larger number of manufacturing-related jobs. The jobs are likely to be few and far between, even if an increase in GDP percentage going to manufacturing is able to be achieved.
And aren't we largely a service economy?
We've become so. I mean,
which is immune to tariffs, pretty much.
Well, over the decades, as most industrialized countries, as they've advanced, the balance between manufacturing and services has changed. By the way, the same is true in Germany, which is often cited as a manufacturing success story, a manufacturing powerhouse. But the percentage of the German economy that is tied to, and German employment that is tied to manufacturing, has declined almost in direct parallel to the United States. And it's because of productivity increases and automation. And so I think that is the issue that we have to deal with. 80% of the American public is now employed in services. And for a long time, there was a premium paid to manufacturing jobs. But recently, now the average service job pays more than the average manufacturing job. And so we have to figure out, are these actually the good jobs that every president hopes to create in the United States? And if so, who is going to benefit from them?
Isn't Trump's reputation for inconsistency a factor here? Because you have a company and the CEO goes to the board and says, fellas and ladies, he's got us. He's imposing high tariffs. We've got to move factories to the United States. And some board member says, well, but suppose we make the capital commitment and then he decides not to have tariffs. Or suppose he decides to remove tariffs. Then where are we? Where do we stand?
I think that's
a factor?
I think that's a real issue, Jim, because first of all, it would be true of any president to a certain degree. These are big decisions for companies to make. They involve billions of dollars of investment. It's not easy to change your supply chains overnight, and so it requires a real commitment. Any president would face that because there would always be the tendency to say, let's just wait it out and see if the next administration. This president, I think in particular, faces that challenge because, as you said, he's been known to change his views on tariffs month by month, week by week, sometimes in the same day. And so it is very hard for companies to make these decisions with this kind of certainty that they need in mind. And as a result, a lot of them are just sitting on the sidelines. They're deciding not to invest, not to hire more people because they don't really know what their cost structure is going to be, what their revenue potential is. It's very hard to value a company when you don't know what the revenue and the costs are going to be.
Now, in our history, we have from time to time imposed tariffs on products. We select the products that we want to impose tariffs on. And at times, as you pointed out, tariffs on countries that are bad actors. And that's been done in administrations of presidents of both parties. But now we have both. We have tariffs on products, and at the same time, with the same countries, tariffs across the board on countries, 50%, some cases, like China, several 100%. This is a one-off, isn't it, in our history? And what's the rationale for that?
Well, I think the president views that the United States has been taken advantage of for a long period of time. We're a relatively open economy. Our average tariff rate is less than many other countries, and that has given great benefits to the American consumer, has allowed for competitiveness of American firms, but it has come at a cost. And the challenges of globalization, and sometimes people conflate trade policy or trade agreements with globalization, but globalization is a force, and it's a force driven largely by technology. The invention of the container and the container ship fundamentally made it possible to put supply chains all over the world. The spread of broadband made it possible to deploy services all over the world. You could have a customer service center in the Philippines or in India. You could do back office processing in other countries because you had broadband internet access. So it's primarily technology that has driven these changes. But the costs of globalization and technology and automation have been acutely felt in particular communities. When a factory closes down and everyone loses their job and the community has seen no new investment come in, that has been a real problem. And that, I think, has been a failure of policy of Democratic and Republican administrations over the years, that we never fully addressed the domestic dislocation that was going on and helping to make sure that workers and communities are able to survive and thrive in a rapidly changing economy. And that is a fundamental challenge today, because however important globalization is, trade agreements, immigration, whatever these other issues are, the potential impact of artificial intelligence is likely to be much greater on American workers. And we have no idea at this point how to ensure that American workers that are likely to be displaced by artificial intelligence are going to be able to thrive in that kind of economy.
Well, Trump announced his grand tariff scheme in April, and the result was the stock market crashed. He then announced he was rolling back the tariffs for 90 days, and he was going to make deals. Well, has he made any significant deals in the 90 days following the announcement in April?
Well, he's reached a couple framework agreements, one with the UK, which was a sort of a partial agreement with a lot of details to be worked out. He's reached an agreement of sorts with China, but it's a funny agreement because what it does, it sort of rolls back the escalation that happened after April. So we raised tariffs and we adopted a bunch of measures. China discovered that they had leverage over the United States in terms of being able to control the export of certain critical minerals and other products. They imposed restrictions, rare earths. They've imposed restrictions on that. And now there's a framework agreement of how to roll this back to where it was before. So it doesn't solve any of the fundamental issues in the U.S.-China relationship. It just gets back to the situation before things began to escalate out of control.
So the history with China has been one of escalation and de-escalation. But as we sit here, nothing definite really has been arrived at, isn't that so?
Well, just some broad sense of how we're going to manage those sorts of issues. But the fundamental issues about China's excess capacity that's exporting to the rest of the world, the subsidization, the role of state-owned enterprises, its intellectual property rights practices, all of those issues which have a potentially significant distortive effect on international trade, those haven't yet been addressed. And as for the rest of the countries, he announced, as you said, on Liberation Day, April 2nd, some potential tariffs as high as 50% or so on countries like Laos and Lesotho, and then began this negotiation process. I think what the administration has found is that these negotiations take more time and are more difficult than they thought. And so they have talked about the potential for issuing letters just announcing what the new tariff would be, which is not a negotiation, it's just a unilateral statement.
Let's take Lesotho, since you mentioned it, a small African nation. Their principal export is blue jeans. Their exports are something like $300 million a year. They can't import much from the United States because they can't afford it. I guess they sell us diamonds. 50% tariff.
Yes.
What sense does that make?
Well, look, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
It throws people out of work in Lesotho.
It will have a deleterious effect in Lesotho, and Lesotho isn't the country that's having a significant effect on the U.S. economy. It's one thing to deal with countries like China.
Number one trading partner or number two trading partner?
Number two, I think Mexico has now exceeded it.
One.
So to deal with Mexico, Canada, China, Japan, the European Union, Korea, these are our major trading partners.
No deals with them yet, except you mentioned China.
A bit on China, but to take the same approach to Lesotho or Laos, or they even announced tariffs against islands that had no people on them. But which is a little hard to understand. Look, I think the fundamental point is that this administration wants to end up in a situation where we are likely to have a 10% across the board baseline tariff on the rest of the world, with certain tariffs higher than that for particular products, maybe like steel or aluminum, which we view as being critical, and against particular countries where we continue to have significant outstanding issues like China and potentially the European Union and others. And that's likely where we're likely to end up. And that means it's going to be more expensive by definition for the U.S. consumer, for the U.S. manufacturer that has up to now imported parts or inputs into their process, and we're going to have to adjust to that. There is a case for tariffs, by the way. There are times when we should be saying we ought to be willing to pay that higher price, for example, for national security. One thing we discovered because of COVID, Fukushima, other incidents, is how fragile our supply chains are and how much dependency we had on particular countries. We're very dependent on China for all sorts of inputs, including about 75% of the active ingredients of our pharmaceuticals. We're obviously very dependent on Taiwan for advanced semiconductor production. I think, frankly, American companies and companies from all over the world grew complacent because it was so attractive to produce in China, so attractive to rely on Taiwan for semiconductors, that we didn't apply the basics of diversification, of risk management, in looking to see where else should we develop supply chains. So we should be willing to pay something more for supply chain diversification, resilience, and for national security. The question is, how broadly does that go? And does it cover the whole economy? Or do you say, here are a handful of products that it is absolutely essential we not be dependent on China or Taiwan or another country because of our national security, and therefore we're going to either want to produce them here in the United States or potentially produce them in friendly countries we have agreements with, that share our national security priorities, share our values, and create a system around that.
So is what you're saying is the disease is there, but the cure might be deleterious, harmful to us?
I think that's right. I mean, I think like in many areas, what President Trump has an unconventional approach to putting issues on the table, needless to say. But there's an element of truth or a nugget of value there that we need to take seriously. Are we going to invade Greenland? Probably not. Should we be more concerned about Arctic security and what China and Russia are doing in the Arctic, particularly with the melting of the polar ice caps and the creation of new trade routes? Yes, we probably should be. And that may lead to a conversation with Greenland and with Denmark about enhanced defense cooperation in certain areas. Are we going to take back the Panama Canal? Probably unnecessary. But should we be concerned about Chinese activity in Latin America, including in infrastructure, including around ports? Sure, that is something that should get more of our attention, and that's the element of what President Trump has said that ought to be taken very seriously.
So if you were the United States Trade Representative, and of course you wouldn't want to be fired, what would you be telling President Trump today?
Well, look, I think I try to connect the dots between different objectives that the president has laid out. He wants to win vis-a-vis China. He wants to make sure we are the winner in certain technologies, that we've got the strongest economy, the most productive, the most innovative economy. And that means perhaps taking a different approach on some other issues. And so pointing out the trade-offs. You know, we're cutting R&D spending. We're hurting the capacity of our universities to operate, where so much of our innovation has come from. Our entire biotech industry, so much of our artificial intelligence industry, quantum computing comes out of our universities and the research being done there and in our national labs. It makes no sense, if you want to be number one, if you want to win, to be cutting the heart of what has made us number one for all these years. And I'd be sort of emphasizing those trade-offs, that if you really want to have a strong position on these issues, then we need to fund these things. We need to keep on nurturing the innovation environment, not killing it.
Because if you lose, you're yielding the ground to China.
Absolutely. And China is very ready, willing, and able to fill the void. As they've seen us pull back internationally or to alienate some of our partners, they have gone on a charm offensive. And quite effectively, what used to be everyone's focus on China, if we just roll back the clock a couple of years, China's decision to back Russia in its invasion of Ukraine did something that was very difficult for U.S. presidents to do, which is to draw the United States and Europe more closely together vis-a-vis the nature of the China challenge. Now, because of what we've done here in the United States, China is not so much the issue, and the United States is the issue. If you travel around the world, every leader, all the ministers, and the publics, their number one concern is what's going on in the United States, not what is China doing. And that lets the spotlight off of China when that's where it should be.
So I have come to the point where I have to ask you a question. Are Trump's tariff policies going to be good or bad for the United States economy and for the world economy?
Well, look, first of all, we don't know what tariffs are ultimately going to get imposed. You know, as you mentioned, he's announced very large tariffs, then he's suspended them, then he's reduced them. Now we're involved in a series of negotiations. So we don't know what, at the end of the day, is going to happen. I think every signal is we're going to have at least 10% tariffs. I think on the whole, that is not good for the U.S. economy. It tends to reduce growth, reduce productivity, reduce competitiveness. Is it catastrophic for the U.S.? Probably not, because trade is still a relatively modest part of our economy, a smaller part of our economy than it is for Europe or for Asia. But will it raise the costs? And we saw, you know, President Trump came to power in large part by running on inflation and the scourge of inflation. And does this add to the inflationary pressures along with others of his policies, his tax cuts and other measures? Yes, it does. And so that's where there's a trade-off, and he's going to have to figure out how to manage that. Also, I mentioned earlier that the globalization's challenge was everyone benefited, but it was invisible. The costs were acute, but they were on relatively small numbers of workers and relatively small numbers of communities. He's turned that all on its head. So now the costs of tariffs are going to be on everybody, and they're going to be quite visible. And the benefits of tariffs, if he's successful, which is a big if, are going to be felt by relatively few workers in relatively few geographies, and several years down the road from now. That's a difficult political problem to manage when everyone is paying the cost now for something that they hope will happen to some of their neighbors in the future. And to his credit, the president has warned the American people that there's going to be costs. We're going through a transition and there's going to be some pain. But Americans are not always particularly good at taking pain and saying we're willing to make this sacrifice for something that might or might not happen in the future.
And the cost will be inflation, at the moment stable at around 4.2%, and there'll be an increase, and also the possibility of recession and slower growth in the United States.
That's right. That's right. You know, we have an experiment. In 2018, President Trump imposed 25% tariffs on steel. 7 years later, we have 1,000 more steel workers than we had in 2018, but we have 75,000 fewer workers in manufacturing sectors that relied on steel because the steel became more expensive and their products became less competitive. And we have a 30% reduction in the productivity of the steel sector. So we have, in a microcosm, of just one sector, 7 years of tariffs, we've seen what happens. If we now apply that across the board, that's the kind of effect that the tariffs might have.
Undesirable. So, Michael Froman, this has been marvelous, and I wish we could go on for another hour, but we've come to the end. So thank you for coming by. Thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. Meanwhile, be well, take care, and all the best. I'm Jim Zirin, and don't forget to download the CUNY TV app so you can hear programs like this wonderful program when you're on the road.